The Shirtwaister Dress Sew-Along, Part 2. I will now start on the collar. So joining the two collar pieces, I will machine from the outer dot all the way around to this dot, not this one, and then trim and clip this edge and turn through. So the edges of the collar are machined. The seam allowance needs to be trimmed. It's best to grade. That is trimming at different widths. This avoids a ridge showing after pressing. Mitre the corners. And clip the outside edge, which is slightly curved. Then turn through. Use an edge tool if you have one, or otherwise anything with a point that isn't too sharp. The collar is ready for pressing. So here it is, pressed. I used the edge tool as I pressed to push out the edge. I'm going to baste the raw edges together to keep the layers in place for the next step. And the next step is to double top stitch around the outer edge. That is, with the interface side facing up. The stitch compensation tool is useful here. It keeps the foot level. That is looking pretty neat. Here I have the collar with the interfaced side face down, and ready to be sandwiched between the bodice and the bodice facing. So here is the bodice. I'm going to snip into these angles just short of the stay stitching. I'm also going to snip along the back neck curve. This will help me to match the bodice to the collar. So line up the collar with the bodice neckline, matching the dots, and lining up the notches with the shoulder seams. Pin carefully at the dots. Match the notches to the shoulder seams. Carefully match dots at the end of the collar. I'm now going to baste to secure these layers for the next step. If you're confident, you could skip the basting and go straight to pinning on the facing from the other side. And then baste through all layers. Remove the pins. I am then going to attach the facing in the same way. The collar will be sandwiched between the layers. Clip to the dots as before. And around the back neckline. And match as before. I then continue to pin the facing to the bodice around the lapels and down the front edges. Again, I will hand baste. And then remove all the pins for machining. Rotate other dots with the needle down. If you feel you have gone off track a little, it's best to unpick a little section and re-stitch. This could make all the difference to the final finish. Take out all the hand basting. Tweezers are really useful for this job. Looking good at this stage. I'll be turning through and sorting out the lapels. But first I need to do some trimming. Again, it's best to grade to smooth out the ridge of the seam allowance. Mitre the lapel corner. Mitre the other corner. Grade around the neckline. I'm now ready to turn the facing through. This is going to look really nice when pressed. If you are not top stitching, you should understitch the seam allowance to the facing along the back neckline. Here is the result after pressing. Pressing over a tailor's ham is a good idea. You can concentrate on small areas this way, without creating creases elsewhere. Moving on after pressing, the pressed edges will be top stitched. I need to mark the break point. I'm referring to the pattern. The break point is a little above the top button. I will be double top stitching around the lapel. I'll continue around the neckline. At the break point, I'll stop and restart on the other side so that the top stitching appears on the right side down the fronts. To prepare for this, I will pin and baste the interfacing in position along this inside edge. You will now understand why I said earlier to trim the interfacing. You don't want it to show. Never mind if, like me, you haven't. It's only on the inside. So carefully spread out the facing and pin all around. Follow the curve. Match the shoulder seams. Keep everything as flat as you can. And then baste. Remove the pins, ready for top stitching. The pin marks the top button position. I'm going to start a little before that. I'm leaving long threads for sewing in later. Stitch the other front. I now have the inside facing up. I'm starting lower than the top button to overlap the previous stitching. So I'm now stitching up and around the lapels. I'll use my stitch compensating tool to get me around the corner. It keeps the foot level. I'm stopping at the shoulder seam. I was going to continue around the back neck edge, but I decided it wasn't going to work. So I'm going to do a row of plain stitching instead later on. One more stitch required here. Now to do the other lapel. I now have a lot of ends to sew in. Worth it though. Back stitching doesn't work well with top stitching. So on to the next stage. I'm pleased with the finish of the lapels. I have changed my mind though about top stitching to secure the facing. I think it will clash with the pure lines of the collar and lapels. So I'm going to settle for just plain machining in matching thread, continuing across the back. That is how I treated the cotton print version I made originally. In the meantime, I will tidy up these threads. Just thread them through the layers rather than tie knots. You could use a bit of fray check if you were worried about it coming undone. I'm stitching the outer edge of the facing to the bodice. It's easier to follow the edge from the inside. Just check your machine stitch is as neat on the reverse side. You may need to adjust your tension. The machining is practically invisible. I managed to unstick and trim away the offending interfacing. I have always liked my garments to be as neat on the inside as the outside. Next, I will sew the buttonholes and sew on the buttons. So that's 3 buttonholes. The fronts will overlap by 1 1/4 inches, 3.2 centimetres. I will button up before sewing on the skirt. The centre front is 5/8 of an inch, just a little over 1.5 centimetres from the front edge. The buttonholes are 1 1/2 inches, just under 4 centimetres apart. They need to end a little over the centre line. Sew 1/2 inch, just over 1 centimetres in from the edge. Mark with a dot. Refer to your sewing machine manual for buttonhole techniques. I find my Bernina automatic buttonhole setting works well, and I always test on spare fabric. Just marking the end point works for me. You can stop the fabric from wandering by keeping the dot in the middle of the frame. Just nudge if necessary, but don't hold the fabric too tightly. Let it do its own thing. The thread is such a good match, you can't really see it. I think most sewers find buttonholes challenging. You are reliant on your sewing machine behaving itself. Fabrics and threads behave differently, and a buttonhole is difficult to unpick. Make sure you have enough thread in your bobbin. Running out halfway through is not good. I'm more than happy with those. The pencil markings will brush off. How do you cut your buttonholes? I use different ways. Sometimes I use the cutter with the wooden block. I think perhaps scissors give you more control, but they must be sharp. I'm pleased with those. Mark the button position. That is 5/8 of an inch, just a little over 1.5 centimetres, in from the front edge. So the buttons are sewn on the centre front line. I'm pleased with the buttons I found online and the delivery was quick. I can now button up for the next stage. And I can now stitch the right hand side seam. The left hand side seam will have the zip, and that's not inserted until the bodice is joined to the skirt. So pin matching the notch. Trim and neaten the seam allowances together, press towards the back and double top stitch. Coming up next, the skirt and the pockets. Please subscribe to this channel here on YouTube. All my tutorials and sew-alongs are free. Hit the notification button and you won't miss any of them. If you subscribe to this channel and check the like button, you will be supporting all my free content. Thank you for watching.